you mentioned a couple times that the goal of the future of medicine is not purely hedonic, or the future of optimization. That old split between hedon and daemon is actually one of the nonsense things dichotomies we have to reconcile. So when we talked about optimizing human experience and human capability, having a underlying philosophic model that shows that the way that people contribute to the whole is actually optimal for their own quality of life experience. And as their quality of life goes up, it increases their capacity and predisposition to contribute to the whole, very much in the same way that a cell relates to the whole body, right? The way that human relates to humanity and to universe. And so we would not throw out hedonism, we would include and transcend it, right? And I think when you said eudaimonia, that's a good word for include and transcend, that people's own experience, their experiential tone being optimized is absolutely useful for then optimizing their capability and predisposition for serving meaningfully, and vice versa. Without deep, meaningful service, there are qualities of personal subjective experience that just don't happen. And so I just wanted to mention that real quick.
The interview I did just 2 weeks ago with Steve Cole, who is a psychoneuroimmunologist at UCLA. He did a study on hedonism versus eudaimonic well-being, and it blew me away. They went into the study, him and Barbara Friedrichsen went into the study thinking, they're going to see similar outcomes of positive physiological responses. And they found that on the psychological scales, the hedonics and the eudaimonics scored equally well on well-being scores. But then when they looked at the health of the immune system, they started looking deeper into these epigenetic marks and blood biomarkers, and they found this is just amazing. The hedonic well-being group actually scored lower than people that had low well-being to begin with, while the eudaimonic group scored off the chart in the health of their immune system. And yet they appeared the same on psychological tests of well-being.
What that means is that the decreased immunity is going to lead to decreased psychological scores over time, right?
Right.
And so some of the team at Neurohacker wrote a really brilliant paper on this. I think it's going to publish soon. But if one is pursuing states of experience that through processes that create momentary spikes but end up eroding baseline, then of course you can have elevated state on the short term and eroded baseline long term. If you are pursuing states of experience where you actually want to evolve the baseline itself, then it's a totally different approach. And this is the 2 marshmallow experiment, right? We all know this, but it is very meaningful to say it is actually anti-addictive. What it ends up creating the highest quality of life, which you could say would be smart hedonism. If someone wants to really have highest quality of experience that gets higher over time, then it's not about short-term spikes. It's about the evolution of baseline. And the evolution of baseline means what actually builds the integrity of the system enduringly.
I'm kind of confused on that one. Can you explain that one just a little bit more to me?
Somebody goes for the chocolate cake. They feel good in the moment. They feel shitty over time as they eat a lot of chocolate cake because they got a dopamine spike, but they got a dopamine spike in a way that affected the rest of their physiology such that it's going to lead to an imbalance in their dopamine opioid axis and a bunch of other systems. So then, of course, as they feel shittier, then they crave more dopamine spikes because their baseline is lower, right? Their baseline well-being is lower, which then wants to feel better more quickly. And as it wants to feel better quickly, then it's going to go for whether it was the chocolate cake, the cocaine, or the whatever it is that creates a hit. And so we can think of addiction as an eroding base, some process to increase subjective well-being quickly that actually decreases the integrity of the system, that lowers the baseline, that creates more desperation to then feel better, which leads to doing the same process, spike.
I gotcha. Yeah. So you were referring to the short-term aspects of it and how that responds. Yeah, I agree with that. And
someone is even pursuing hedonism intelligently, which says, I actually want to feel good, but I want to feel continuously good and progressively more so over a long period of time. A fundamentally different approach has to be taken.
I still think that's going to come down to, though, like they found, in psychological well-being scores, the people who pursued hedonism on a regular basis, they scored very well on that psychological well-being, just as well as the ones that were, living life with a purpose per se. But, I think that there is some aspects that we're all going to experience that hedonistic approach. But I think if we have that overriding purpose, that vision of where we want things to be, and we're living towards it. I mean, just, one of the examples that Dr. Cole used was, the person who climbs Mount Everest. I mean, sure, you can look at that as potentially a hedonistic aspect, but if they're doing it to show humanity that it can be done, then that's a whole different psychological aspect to their well-being that they're utilizing there. Go ahead.
I think that the dichotomy that I'm speaking to that is worth reconciling is there is an old Puritan distinction where pleasure is a bad thing and particular interpretation. And so really we're seeking pleasure in the afterlife or something, right? Sacrifice is a good thing, and purpose and meaning end up not being associated with pleasure. And that distinction is an obsolete one, right? Well, we can say that the highest kinds of the pleasure that are very real, because like you said, you have some psychological scores from people who are pursuing, who are focused on their own state versus focused on some larger things that include their own state. And the key is focused on larger purposes, but that will end up including their state rather than excluding it. And so as people pursue being of use to larger than themselves, that will end up inexorably leading to them feeling better. And as to the degree that people actually feel better, they will have more resources to show up more. So I would like to have people think about advancing their own subjective quality of life and advancing their utility to the whole as being intersymbiotic with each other.